Even within a country, there are large changes in the standard of living over time. In the United States, over the past century, average income as measured by real GDP per person has grown about 2% per year, and average income has roughly doubled every 35 years. Growth rates vary substantially from country to country. International data on real GDP per person give you some sense of how much the level of growth of standard of livings vary around the world. The role of productivity, the amount of goods and services produced for each hour of work, is very important. Nation's standard of living is determined by the productivity of its workers. There is a link between productivity and economic policies that a nation pursues. The world's richest countries are not guaranteed to remain the richest, and the world's poorest countries are not doomed to endless poverty. But what explains the changes over time? Why do some countries zoom ahead while others lag behind? Why is productivity so important? Productivity is the quantity of goods and services produced from each unit of labor input. Standard of living is tied to productivity. A country's standard of living depends on its ability to produce goods and services. How is productivity determined? First, physical capital per worker. Physical capital, that's the stock of equipment and structures that are used to produce goods and services. A worker with only basic hand tools can make less furniture each week than a worker with sophisticated and specialized woodworking equipment. The inputs used to produce goods and services, labor, capital, and so on, are called factors of production. An important feature of capital is that it is a produce factor of production. That means capital is an input into the production process that in the past was an output of the production process. Thus, capital is a factor of production used to produce all kinds of goods and services, including more capital. Human capital is a second determinant of productivity. Human capital is the knowledge and skills that workers acquire through education, training, and experience. Like physical capital, human capital raises a nation's ability to produce goods and services. Also, like physical capital, human capital is a produce factor of production. Producing human capital requires inputs in the form of teachers, libraries, students, and time. Indeed, students can be viewed as workers who have the important job of producing human capital that will be used in future production. A third determinant of productivity is natural resources. Natural resources are input into production that are provided by nature, such as land, rivers, and mineral deposits. Natural resources take two forms, renewable and non-renewable. Oil is an example of non-renewable resources. Oil is produced by nature over many of years. Once the supply of oil is depleted, it is impossible to create more. A forest is an example of renewable resource. When one tree is cut down, a seedling can be planted in its place to be harvested in the future. Differences in natural resources are responsible for some of the differences in standard of living around the world. For instance, the United States has a large supply of land suited for agriculture. The Middle East, such as Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, are rich in oil. Although natural resources are important, they are not necessary for an economy to be highly productive in goods and services. Japan, for example, imports lots of its natural resources and exports its manufactured goods to economies rich in natural resources. The fourth determinant of productivity is technological knowledge, the understanding of the best ways to produce goods and services. Technological change can free up labor, which can then be used to produce other goods and services. Technological knowledge takes many forms. Some technology is common knowledge. After one person uses it, everyone becomes aware of it. For example, the automobile. Another technology is proprietary. It is known only by the company that discovers it. For example, Coca-Cola's secret recipe for making its famous soft drink. The patent system gives that company a temporary right to its exclusive manufacturer. Technological knowledge refers to society's understanding about how the world works. Human capital refers to the resources expended transmitting this understanding to the labor force. Economic growth and public policy. What can government policy do to raise productivity and standard of living? Savings and investment. Society can change the amount of capital it has. One of the 10 economic principles is that people face trade-offs. For society to invest in more in capital, it must consume less and save more of its current income. The growth that arises from capital accumulation is not a free lunch. It requires that society sacrifice consumption of goods and services in the present and enjoy consumption in the future. Diminishing returns and catch-up effect. Capital is subject to diminishing returns. As the stock of capital rises, the extra output produced from an additional unit of capital falls. In other words, when workers already have a large quantity of capital to use in producing goods and services, giving them additional unit of capital increases their productivity only slightly. Capital's diminishing returns is sometimes called the diminishing marginal product of capital. Because of diminishing returns, an increase in the savings rate leads to higher growth only for a while. As the higher savings rate allows more capital to be accumulated, the benefit from additional capital becomes smaller over time, and so growth slows down. In the long run, the higher savings rate leads to higher level of productivity and income, but to higher growth in these variables, but not to higher growth in these variables. The property of diminishing returns to capital has another important implication. All things being equal, it is easier for a country to grow fast if it starts out relatively poor. This effect of initial conditions on subsequent growth is sometimes called the catch-up effect. In poor countries, workers lack even the most rudimentary skills and as a result have low productivity. Thus, small amounts of capital investment can substantially raise their workers' productivity. By contrast, workers in rich countries have high productivity, partly because they have large amounts of capital to work with. When the amount of capital per worker is already high, additional capital investment has a relatively small effect on productivity. So, poor countries tend to grow faster at faster rates than rich countries. Investment from abroad.